Okay, good morning, everyone. Before we start, I just wanted to make a brief announcement. I think everyone got this little flyer. Tomorrow we're beginning our annual fundraising where we have matchers, and every penny that you give, it's matched 4 times over, up until a certain limit. So that's tomorrow. It'll start at 10 a.m. It'll go through Tuesday, 10 p.m., 36 hours. We left off last week with a little incident that I want to repeat. A group of Chabad women traveled, I believe it was Detroit, for a program. I guess it was a whole weekend and a whole Shabbaton. And on the way back, they got stuck in the airport for probably weather conditions. Their flight was either canceled or delayed, and they didn't know what to do. You have dozens, if not hundreds, of women stuck in the airport. So they call up, since they were going as an official group of Chabad, they called up the Rebbe to get his guidance. And they mentioned to the Rebbe's secretary, who answered the phone, "We're stuck here in Detroit, in the airport, and we want the Rebbe's guidance." And the Rebbe's response was, through the secretary, "What does the word stuck mean?" And they started to explain, to translate it into simpler English. And the secretary, I'm sure he laughed, he chuckled, and he said, "The Rebbe knows English. He knows English very well." If you remember, maybe you don't remember, but I remember, there was a very nationally famous professor named Leslie Fiedler who had an audience with the Rebbe. It's a long story, but I'm not going to go into it. But when he came out, he was impressed and amazed at the Rebbe's command of the English language. So he didn't need a translation of the word stuck. The Rebbe says, "I don't understand, how could a Jew ever be stuck in a place? When you're in a place, you were put there by God, you have a special mission, and the fact that you're there means that you have to do something to strengthen Judaism, to strengthen our connection with God, with the Jewish people." And what they did then is they had candles and candlesticks that they were giving out in Detroit, and they went through the airport and they found Jewish women and they gave them the Shabbos candles so they could light Shabbos candles. They realized that they were there for a purpose. So connecting that to another incident, there was a group of prisoners in Florida. I think they were in minimum security, and they were given an opportunity to have a furlough to come to Brooklyn, to Crown Heights, and they were with the Rebbe in his gathering, on Shabbos gathering. Just as an incidental thing, the Rebbe gave instructions that they shouldn't all be sitting together, not to call attention to their status. People will ask, "Who is this group over here?" And people will say, "Well, these are prisoners," and that's not very pleasant for people to hear, that everyone is looking at them as prisoners. So the Rebbe said they should sit in different places so no one should call attention to their situation as prisoners. That was the sensitivity he was showing to them. But one of his talks, the Rebbe spoke specifically about people in prison. He says, "You're not in prison just because you committed a crime. You were put there, you're not stuck in prison, to use that same word. You were put there, you have a mission." And this is the first time they ever heard anything else but, "You're a bunch of criminals, you're in prison because you committed crimes, you're going to have to pay the price." This is the first time they heard that they have a purpose and that their lives have meaning. And that was the beginning, maybe, or it certainly was a major thrust that the Rebbe's campaign to reach Jews who are in prison, and that's why Chabad all over the world has a tremendous amount of prison visitation and prison involvement, prison chaplains and so on. On Purim, when you're supposed to give gifts to the poor, the Rebbe says there's no more poor person than an inmate in a prison, because they have nothing. Whatever they have is really not theirs anymore. They have nothing, and it's a mitzvah to help them, especially on Purim. At any rate, that's another example of you're not stuck, no matter what your situation is, even if it's a result of something you did that was bad. You're not there because you forgot a prayer on Shabbos. I haven't found anyone in all my visits to Attica. No one was there because they left out one of the prayers on Shabbos. It's usually a little bit more serious than that. But they have to know that they have a purpose. I remember visiting a nursing home, the Weinberg campus, and there was a Jewish resident who was not able to do the things that she was able to do in her early years. And she was so depressed, saying, what purpose do I have? What can I do? What can I accomplish? And I told her that God only asks of you to accomplish something that is within your reach. But everyone has the ability. If you call up your fellow resident and you wish them good morning, you ask them how they're doing, that's your way of changing the world. Even though it sounds like a very minimal gesture, what's the big deal saying good morning to someone? But because you're in this situation and everyone else is in the same situation, that's what God wants of you on your level. And sometimes that little act on your level could have implications way beyond what you think you've accomplished. You don't have to be doing things that are earth-shattering. That's the mistake that a lot of us make, that we think if we're not going to make a major difference in the world, what is the point of our minor differences? They mean a lot. Small changes are not insignificant. There was a black leader, Janice Robertson. She was running for city council in New York, and she came to the Rebbe. The Rebbe every Sunday, as I mentioned, would distribute dollars for charity to thousands of people, and many non-Jews would come as well. And this candidate was there, and the Rebbe explained to her that she doesn't have to save the whole world. Whatever she's going to do in her own limited situation has tremendous value and tremendous meaning. And we often get carried away with, we have to make sure that we change the whole world. We'll talk more about it as we go on. Another example of this was a rabbi in Australia, a rabbi I knew very well, Rabbi Chaim Gutnick. He was a very, very prominent rabbi, and he had a large following. And the Rebbe once asked him if he ever gave classes about marriage to women, specifically for women, and he said no. So the Rebbe said it would be a good idea for you to start one of a series of classes. And of course, when he got back to Australia, he made a major campaign in advertising, flyers all over the place. I think it was before the internet, so it wasn't on the internet, but it was whatever you could do to publicize it. It was a series of classes. How many women showed up? One. He was devastated for all the effort that he put in. He's a famous rabbi in Australia. He's a very dynamic speaker and very dynamic person. He was devastated, such a failure. And the second class and the third class, the whole series, only one, the same woman showed up, and that was it. Now, a year later, he visited the Rebbe again, and the Rebbe reminded him, how did it go? How did that series of classes go? He said it was a total failure. Why was it a failure, the Rebbe asked? Because only one woman showed up. And the Rebbe says, how many mothers did Moses have? You only need one mother to produce a Moses. Why did you underestimate the value, the power of what you accomplished with that one woman? That was good enough. Even though the Rebbe, interestingly, the Rebbe had this paradoxical, whatever you did, the Rebbe would always demand you do more. Someone would come to the Rebbe and he says, I just published this book, a book about Judaism. The Rebbe's remark invariably would be, when is volume 2 coming out? If someone said, I donated $500,000 to Chabad, the Rebbe would say, or to any other charity, the Rebbe would say, when are you going to give $1 million? Someone once asked the Rebbe, you're not happy with what I did? And the Rebbe said, I'm very happy, I'm just not satisfied. But at the same time, the Rebbe treasured small little gestures. And I'll just share a story or two about that. There was a time when the Rebbe, it seems, was in a very down mood. I don't want to use the word depressed, but he was being weighed down by all the tsaras, all the misfortunes that he was exposed to, because the Rebbe, I mentioned this before, on the average would get hundreds of letters a day. It was a point where he got about almost 1,000 letters a day who were writing these letters? People who had problems, health problems, marriage problems, financial problems, any problem you could think of, people would write to the Rebbe for his guidance and his blessing. And the Rebbe would respond to thousands and thousands of these letters. We have right now about 50 volumes of the Rebbe's letter that are published, which is a small percentage of what his response to people's letters were. And it seems that he was getting a lot of bad news, and the Rebbe once complained, people tell me all their bad news. When things get better, they don't notify me. And he really treasured when someone would send him a message that things got better. But at any rate, the Rebbe was very down, and his aides were trying to cheer him up. And nothing worked. And this went on for a few weeks until he got a letter from a child, again in Detroit. I don't know why Detroit is so prominent here. Anyone from Detroit here? So it was a kid from Detroit, a 10-year-old kid, and the kid writes to the Rebbe, and this was not a Chabad kid. He says, I go to school in the school bus, and that's when I say my prayers in the morning. But it's very noisy. You know what a school bus is like in the morning? And I can't concentrate on the prayers. So I made a resolution, and I wake up 15 minutes earlier every day, and I say my prayers before I go on the school bus. That cheered the Rebbe up, and he wrote a letter to the child. And the letter was, I remember just a few words that verbatim, your letter to me was like cold water on a weary soul. And the Rebbe's whole demeanor changed. But the Rebbe's aides were telling him about big accomplishments. The Rebbe was not impressed with big accomplishments. He was impressed when a child made a little sacrifice. If they would have told him that adults made sacrifices, maybe that would have cheered him up as well, but especially a child. Purim is customary to give, not just customary, it's an obligation that we give shlach manos. We give little gifts of food, 2 edibles to at least one friend. And it doesn't have to be expensive, elaborate, but some people who have the means will give an elaborate gift. And a lot of people would send the Rebbe their shlach manos. And they would send really elaborate gifts worth hundreds of dollars. And the Rebbe wouldn't use any of it. He would give it all to charity and take down the names of the people to express gratitude to them. So the Rebbe's wife, the Rebbitzin, was working with some students to take away all the shlach manos and to send it away to different charitable causes. And there was a little shlach manos. It was probably like an apple and a little small jar of a bottle of juice, probably worth about 50 cents. And they were about to put that in the same bag with all the other shlach manos, and the Rebbitzin said, no, don't put this away. The Rebbe will want to see this one. But that's 50 cents. The others were $50 or $200. Because the Rebbe realized if someone is sending an apple with a little bottle of juice, that means someone didn't have the money to give it, and it was the gesture, and the Rebbe treasured that gesture, and the Rebbitzin knew that the Rebbe would really value to see that, not just get the name of the person, but to see what they gave. One final anecdote. In the city of Lubavitch, one of the largest cities in the world, probably about 500 people who live there. This is over 100 years ago. There was a children's magazine, and it featured a story of a convention of Yetzer Haras. A Yetzer Hara is the evil inclination in us that gets us to do things that we shouldn't be doing. And one day, the Yetzer Haras of the world gathered for their annual convention where they have to report all their accomplishments. So the Yetzer Hara of Lubavitch was also invited, but he was a little short, emaciated Yetzer Hara because he didn't really have the ability to do very much evil in this town of Lubavitch, because this was a town where people were just studying Torah and doing mitzvahs. And he's really embarrassed because all the other Yetzer Haras were tall, heavy, smoking big fat cigars, and they're all bragging about the accomplishments. I got this person to commit fraud, I got this person to commit murder, I got this person to commit some other terrible crime. And each representative had to get up to give a report. And he's terrified that they're going to ask him to give a report, this Yetzer Hara from Lubavitch. Well, what happens, they finally, at the end, they ask him to give his report, and he's so embarrassed. He gets up there, he says, I'm a nobody. My accomplishments are zero compared to what you've done. And then the chairman gets up there and says, no, you're making a big mistake. If not for your little Yetzer Hara, we wouldn't have the power to do our work. It's the small gestures that have the ability to impact the whole world in ways that even major undertakings could not accomplish. When we read the Torah, it's read in shul with certain chanting called trop in Yiddish, trope in English, I guess. And there are different notes that are repetitive. There's one note that appears only 4 times in the whole Torah. The note is called Shalsheles. Shalsheles means a chain, and if you see it depicted, it's like a zigzag. It's supposed to resemble a chain, and when you sing it like a chain. Shalsheles goes 3 times up the octave, and it only appears 4 times in the Torah, and it baffles commentators why this particular note and why in these 4 places. So we're going to go through all these 4 places, and we'll see that the common denominator is that all of these 4 things are attached to something that you might think of as a minor, insignificant action, and it led to a whole chain of events that led to some very, very powerful and very positive results. The first time is the story of Lot. Lot was Abraham's nephew who took up residence in the city of Sodom, the ancient Las Vegas, the Sin City. And it was going to be destroyed. And the angel was sent to save Lot because he was Abraham's nephew. And as he's going out of the city, the Torah says, Vayismah ma, and he tarried. He was reluctant to leave, and they forced him out. And that word, and he tarried, which in Hebrew was one word, has that note on it, that Shalsheles, that zigzag chain reaction note. That's the first time it appears in the Torah. And the commentators try to find different explanations. One, the standard explanation is that tarrying is an act of procrastination, and it stretches out. So the note stretches out as well. But I think there's a much deeper explanation. What happened as a result of his tarrying? He had to take refuge in a cave with his 2 daughters, who thought they were the only survivors. And they got him drunk, and they had relations with him and produced 2 sons, Moab and Ammon. So what's so special about that? Moab was the ancestor of Ruth. And Ruth, who converted to Judaism, married Boaz, the leader of the Jewish people at that time, whose great-grandson was David, King David, which started the Davidic Dynasty that will last all the way through history until Mashiach comes, who will be a descendant of King David. In other words, that one seemingly insignificant act, of tarrying led to a whole chain of events that could not have happened otherwise, that produces the leadership of the Jewish people and ultimately will bring us to Mashiach, the one who will bring the world to its perfection and completion. It all started with an insignificant act.
Rabbi, but it also says that this incredible result happened from sin.
Yes, that's a separate question. Why did it have to involve sin? Why did it have to involve incest? Even
sin has value.
Okay, that's another subject which we won't get into right now, because it's true that, as I mentioned before, people end up in prison. They didn't go to prison because they were righteous. They went to prison because they committed a crime. But even so, there's purpose in that. God wanted these people in that location for them to do something that will change the world, even if it's a minor gesture. So that's true. The second time It's missing over here. I don't know what happened. Okay, it goes from 1 to 3. No, you have 2 over there?
Yeah.
No, it's the same thing. Yeah, it's not going to help.
No.
It goes from 1 to 3. 2 is cut out.
Oh, I see.
But I remember 2. Abraham had a son, Isaac, and he wanted to get him married. So he sends his servant Eliezer to Abraham's birthplace to find a suitable match for his son. And Eliezer gets to this place and he says, Vayomar, and he says, and what does he say? That if someone is going to come and I'll ask this girl to give me some water, and she'll offer giving me water and also providing water for my camels, that will prove to me that that's the right person. This is what he says. He's telling God, I am going to make this test. If this girl will show kindness by offering not just to give me water, but to give the water to my camels as well, that's the sign that God has chosen this girl. And what happened as a result? That girl was Rebecca, and the end is they got married, and that's the beginning, the first marriage in the Torah, first Jewish marriage in the Torah, which produced Jacob and then produced the Jewish people, and the rest is history. And that word, Vayomar, and he said, in Hebrew it's one word, has that Shalsheles, has that chain note on it, that unusual note. What is the Vayomar? And he said, that's so prosaic. That's he just said something, but those words that he said produced the Jewish nation. It produced a whole chain of events that led to the Jew. If he wouldn't have said that, who knows who he would have chosen to be Yitzchak's wife, and that would have turned out to be a very disastrous relationship perhaps. It wasn't the right person, and we would never have the Jewish nation. So the Jewish nation starts, the whole chain of events starts with a prosaic note, prosaic word, Vayomer, and he said. Number 3, Joseph was sold by his brothers. And he ends up in the house of one of the king's ministers, Potiphar. And Potiphar's wife falls in love with him, and she tries to seduce him. And what happens? Vayima'ain is, and he refused. And the end is he runs out of the house, and he's accused of, she accuses him of him trying to seduce her, and he's thrown into prison. Those words, and he refused, have that note, that unusual note, that chain note. Because what happened as a result of his refusal? Let's see what happens. He's thrown into prison. If he would have succumbed to the advances of Potiphar's wife, nothing would have happened to him. He wouldn't have been thrown into prison. What happens in prison? He sees 2 people are depressed. One is the baker of the king, one is the butler. And he asks them, what's the problem? And they say, well, we had a dream. And he interprets the dream correctly, and he tells the butler, please remember me, mention my name before Pharaoh, because he'll reinstate you. And he forgot about it, but 2 years later, Pharaoh has a dream. He sees 7 fat cows swallowing 7 lean cows, and they still remain 7 lean cows swallowing 7 fat cows, and they remain lean. And no one can interpret that dream, and Joseph interprets it, and as a result, he becomes the prime minister of Egypt, and his whole family comes to Egypt, and it led to the enslavement of the Jewish people, and then the Exodus, and so on and so forth. It all began with Joseph's gesture by Yima'in, and he refused. By him refusing, you would think, what's the big deal? He did the right thing, but that little gesture produced a chain of events that led to the Jewish people in Egypt, and subsequently their exodus from Egypt and the formation of a Jewish nation. We were forged in Egypt. All that started with one act, one gesture, and he refused.
Would you say that in some way This is also related to the concept of divine providence.
Yes, yes. Everything is all connected to divine providence. That every situation, it sounds like it's insignificant, but nothing is insignificant. Everything has a purpose. Now, not everything that happens are we aware of, and we'll talk more about that later. When do we invoke divine providence, and when do we not invoke it? But here we see that small little actions, small gestures, could blossom into major events that can change the whole world. If we had to do the right thing and it had no impact on the world, we'd still do it. But the truth is that there's no such thing as an unimpactful positive action. But not only positive, as you said before, even negative actions could have more results attached to them, and that they happen at a certain time in a certain place, and we shouldn't minimize the value of those small actions. The fourth time that this note appears is in the desert. They build the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary, and for a week it had to be initiated. Moses was training his brother Aaron to do the service, and the last service is Vayishchat, where Moses slaughters the sacrifice. That was the final sacrifice in the dedication of the Mishkan, of the sanctuary. And that word, Vayishchat, and he slaughtered, which is a word that appears so many times in the Torah, but in this particular case, it has that Shalsheles, that chain note, because that was the final act of initiation that prepared the tabernacle for all of the services of his brother Aaron, and subsequently to the priests, and to all of the hundreds of years, thousands of years, and ultimately eternal events of offerings to God in the temple. All of that started with Moses' simple action, Vayishchat, and he slaughtered. It doesn't sound like much. He just finished initiating them, but that was the beginning of a whole chain of events. One final point in this regard, going back to Joseph. Maimonides writes, and he bases this on the Talmud, that a person should always view everything they do as if the world is evenly balanced between good and evil. We don't really know the balance, but we have to imagine that the world is evenly balanced. If everything is evenly balanced, even a feather could tip the scales. So that every action that we do, we should imagine that we are going to tip the scales and save the world. That's how we should view every time we are confronted with a choice. Should we do the right thing? But it's a minimal thing. It's not so important. We think it might not be so important. But even if it is a minimal action, that could be the feather that tips the scales and saves the world. So the Rebbe once gave an illustration where we could see this happening in real life. Again, going back to Joseph. Joseph is in his prison cell, and he sees two fellow prisoners in a depressed mood. Now Joseph could have said, I'm going to mind my own business. If they're depressed, I have as many reasons to be depressed as they do. So let me worry about myself. I don't care about the other prisoners. Anyhow, the other prisoners, we could see, were not nice people, because the butler, after Joseph tells him and interprets the dream for him, says, "Could you please remember my name in the presence of Pharaoh?" And he forgets about Joseph. So he wasn't very much imbued with gratitude. He was not a nice guy. He was probably an idol worshiper like the most Egyptians were. So Joseph should have said, it's none of my business. They're depressed. Let them be depressed. Now, instead, Joseph goes over to them and says, why are you in a bad mood? Why are you depressed? And they tell him that they had this dream. Joseph interprets the dream. 2 years later, Pharaoh has a dream, as I mentioned before, and no one could interpret the dream except Joseph. But how did he know Joseph could interpret a dream? Because he had interpreted the butler's dream successfully, and now the butler remembered, now that the king was going crazy because he needed someone to interpret it, he tells the king, I know someone who was in prison with me who's able to interpret dreams. And Joseph interprets the dream, and Pharaoh was so impressed that he installs him as the prime minister, the viceroy. And what does Joseph do? Joseph saves Egypt and the rest of the world that was in state of drought and famine, because he was the one who knew that there were going to be 7 years of plenty, after which there'll be 7 years of terrible famine that will devastate the whole world. And therefore he said, prepare for 7 years, store the food so you have the food in the 7 years of famine, and that saved the world. Where did it all begin? If Joseph had not considered the feelings of the butler and the baker, if he would have said, I'm going to mind my own business, I'm not going to ask them why they're depressed, they wouldn't have ever known that Joseph knows how to interpret dreams. So if they wouldn't have known that, Pharaoh's dream would have gone uninterpreted and the world would have starved. So here, one little gesture was the trigger to lead to a point where he was able to save the world. Everything that happens, as I mentioned last week, is not coincidental. We don't believe in coincidences. Everything has a purpose why it happens. Sometimes we see the purpose, sometimes we see what God had in mind for us, sometimes we don't see. But it always has a purpose. But there are different levels of divine providence. Sometimes it involves none of our actions. Things just happen the way they happen. But sometimes it involves our actions. If we didn't do the action that we did, then the divine providence wouldn't have worked the way it works. It's supposed to work. We set into motion that whole sequence of events. And sometimes it just means being in the right place at the right time. Let me share a story, a few stories. But this is a story where no positive action was involved. At least it doesn't seem that it was it might have been viewed as less of a positive action. Everyone has heard about the Inquisition in Spain, where anyone who professed any other religion but Christianity would be punished, would be put to death, burnt alive. Many Jews who stayed in Spain in 1492, that's when those who didn't want to convert had to be expelled. They were expelled actually the day before Columbus sailed to America. Actually, he was scheduled to sail on Tisha B'Av, the national day of mourning, and it was postponed for the next day. Some say because he didn't want to leave on Tisha B'Av, that he was Jewish, but that's for a different discussion. There's a famous song, in 1492, Columbus was a Jew. But anyhow, many Jews decided they can't leave their businesses, they can't leave the prosperity that they enjoyed in Spain. So publicly they professed to become Catholics. Privately, secretly, they would practice Judaism. But the authorities were very suspicious of them for good reason, that they were not sincere converts. And whenever they would find some Jew, hidden Jew, whom they refer to as Marranos, which means pigs, they would interrogate them, torture them to get a confession, and then put them to death by auto de fe, which means an act of faith, by burning them alive. And this lasted until way into the 19th century. So but this goes back about 250 years. One of the ministers in the King of Spain's government was a Marrano, a converso, as the more polite way of describing them. And he was caught practicing Judaism secretly. He didn't know too much about Judaism. He knew a little bit. This was already 200 years after the expulsion. But he knew enough to be identified as a practicing Jew, and he was sentenced to death. But because he was a minister of the king, and the king valued his counsel, the king pleaded with the Inquisition, please let him live. Absolutely not. There was a rivalry between the monarchy and the church had power that even the monarchy didn't have, but they respected the monarchy to a certain point. So the king says, give him a reprieve for at least 1 year. Let him live 1 more year. So they agreed to that. And the year comes to an end. The king pleads, give him another year. They said, no more. Another month. Okay, we'll give him another month. The month is coming to an end, and the king pleads, give him another month. No. Another week? Okay, another week. The week comes to an end. The king asks, can you give him another week? No. Another day? Okay, fine. One more day. The day comes to an end, and the king pleads another day. No, absolutely not. And they tie him to the stake, and they're ready to start the execution, and an earthquake erupts. And everyone escapes and runs helter-skelter, and he's able to escape, and he leaves Spain. And he was so moved by what happened, by the miracle that he was saved, that he said to himself, he said to God, if this was God's intervention to save my life, then I will become a publicly professed Jew. I will no longer hide my Judaism. I will no longer leave this dual life. But if I can't be convinced that this was a miracle for my sake, then I'll remain the way I have been till now. I'll practice Christianity publicly. I'll have the best of both worlds, and privately I'll be a Jew. And he went from town to town, from country to country, consulting with theologians and philosophers, and no one could convince him that it was a miracle. And he heard of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, and he comes to the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov says, go to my student Wolf Kitzis. The student Wolf Kitzis is the ancestor of one of my brothers-in-law. Why the Baal Shem Tov sent him to this student is a mystery. And the student says, this was not a miracle. That earthquake was programmed into nature from the beginning of creation, that at that time, at that place, there's going to be an earthquake. You're looking in the wrong direction. The miracle was that the king postponed your execution by a year. If he would have postponed it by 2 years, you would have been dead. If after the year was over, he would have gotten an extension, anything more or less than a month, you would have been dead. So the fact that all the events coincided to bring about your salvation, that was the miracle, that was the divine providence. Sometimes we look for miracles the wrong way. God doesn't have to intervene with a Cecil B. DeMille. Is that the one who produced? Yeah. You don't need such an extravaganza miracle. Those miracles did happen and still do happen every now and then, but those are not the miracles we should be looking for. God likes to do things within nature, and how does he do it? He makes many fortuitous events come together. There's a book called Small Miracles. Have you ever read that book? It's a series of books by two Jewish women about they call small miracles, of stories of coincidences. And there's one story, I think it might be the first story in the book, that stands out. That's the one I remember. I don't remember all the others. And this is a story of a Chabad rabbi in Montreal who was not a practicing rabbi. He was ordained, but he was a business person. And he would travel by car from Montreal to New York on a regular basis. And he never had any problems falling asleep. He was very much alert when he would drive. And that's how he conducted himself for years. One time, he decided to take his van, his minivan, instead of his car, which was unusual. He usually took his car, but he takes his van, and he's driving down from Montreal, and he's going through the Adirondack Mountains. And he starts to become very tired. He never experienced such tiredness as he did then. So he went off the road to find a motel so he could sleep. And he stops at a gas station and he asks them, can you tell me names of motels? He looks up the different motels. They're all booked solid. This was even before the season, the vacation season, but somehow people were coming early and all the motels were, he has to go to sleep. So he says, is there a nursing home perhaps in this area? Maybe they have an extra bed. So he calls up, they tell him there's a nursing, there are probably not too many nursing homes in that area, but there's one nursing home. He calls them up, do you have an empty room? I'll pay for it. And they said, yes, we have an empty bed. And he sleeps the night, he comes up from his room, comes down, wherever, and he pays whatever they asked him to pay. And then he says to himself, and this is the key thing, he says to himself, you know what, I'm a rabbi. God put me in this place. There must be a reason why I'm here. Everything is so unusual. He says, maybe I can be of some service to a Jewish resident of this nursing home. Are there any Jewish residents, he asks. He says, funny that you asked. There was one, and he just passed away today. And he said, well, where is he going to be buried? Oh, we have a cemetery over here. Is it a Jewish cemetery? No, what Jews? In Adirondacks, there are no Jewish cemeteries. And he says, well, maybe I could take him to New York with me. And they looked at him like he was crazy. But he was serious. He was dead serious. Well, they made a few phone calls. And he was able to get whatever license. And now he had a minivan. He was able to put the body there. If he had his car, he wouldn't have been able to do it. He'd have to sit him up in the front seat. This is a true story.
Oh my God.
And so now he's carrying this body, and he decides, I'm going to go to a Jewish cemetery, and they'll be glad to handle it. And he comes to one cemetery. They said, we don't do these things over here, you know. And he goes from one cemetery to another. And then one of them tells him, you know, in Manhattan, there's an organization that funds burial for indigent people, for people who can't afford a burial. And you'll go to them and they'll arrange everything. So he goes to Manhattan, and sure enough, he finds the person in charge, and the person says, yes, we'll take care of the burial, but we have to have his name. Of course, he got the name when he left with the body, and he gives the name. And the guy says, can you wait a minute? He goes into another room and comes back. 50 or 60 years ago, a very wealthy man endowed this organization with the money to bury poor people. And then he left town, and we never know what happened to him. This is the man. This is the man who paid for all the people that were buried in that area who were poor. And that's how he got buried. If that's not divine providence, I don't know what is. That's what they call a small miracle. But it's not small. There are big miracles, but they happen through what apparently seems to be insignificant coincidences. I'll tell you a story of my family. I have a nephew who has a child who suffers from a very rare genetic disorder. And at one point, he became very ill, had complications, and he had to undergo surgery. This happened about 12 years ago. He had to undergo surgery, but it was a very dangerous surgery on his condition. And my nephew was in the hospital all night with him. He was waiting. His wife was going to replace him in the morning, but he was in the hospital all night. And after the surgery was over, the baby would not awaken. And the doctor's prognosis was very grim, that the chances were that he wasn't going to survive. So my nephew leaves the hospital. His wife was going to come replace him. And on his way to get his car, he's thinking to himself, I'm a follower of the Rebbe. Is the Rebbe now aware of what I'm going through? Could he help me? Is he aware? And he's plagued by this thought that maybe the Rebbe is not aware. He's not physically reachable, so maybe he's not connected. Then he gets his car and he pays for the parking garage, and he gives a large bill, and he gets change. And in the change there was a $1 bill that the Rebbe had given someone, because when people would get, the Rebbe every Sunday would give $1 to each and every person that came by. The idea was to give it to charity or its replacement and add more to a charity of your choice. People would keep that $1. You wouldn't give it away, you wouldn't spend it. But what happened sometimes is people would lose the $1. Or sometimes little kids would go into their mother's pocketbook and take $1 and go to the candy store and buy something. And somehow these dollars circulated in a very limited way. And here he gets change. This is in Hartford, Connecticut, not in Brooklyn. He gets $1. How does he know it's the Rebbe's $1? Because people would write on it, this is the $1 I got from the Rebbe. and the dollar had a date on it. The date was the 3rd day of Elul, which is the yahrzeit of my father, the great-grandfather of the child after whom the child was named. And as soon as he got that dollar, he cheered up, and he calls his wife and he says, I know things are going to get better. And within 45 minutes, the child awakens. This is a personal story. One other personal story, I'll leave some more stories for next week. One other personal story, or at least in my family. My father, of blessed memory, was sent by the previous Rebbe to Poland in July of 1939. Most perfect time to travel to Poland. And within 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, World War II breaks out. My father went with a group of 6. He was part of a group of 6. And the problem was he was an American citizen and America wasn't in the war, so it was not impossible for him to get out. But he had no money. They didn't come to Europe with money to buy tickets for 6 people. And they were in a hotel. This is on the very day that the war breaks out. And not knowing how are we going to get out of the country. Now in that same hotel there was a rabbi whose name was Isby. And he was going around forlorn, very worried, and they asked him, what's your problem? He says, I have a lot of money, but they won't let me take it out of the country. Well, how much do you have? It was the exact amount they needed to buy tickets for the 6 students that were stranded in Poland. And what they did, he bought tickets for everyone, and when they came to America, they reimbursed him, and he got his money out, and they got them their lives out of Poland. 4 generations later, Rabbi Isby had a great grandson, I'm not sure if it was a great grandson, great granddaughter, and he was in a very difficult plight. And my father's great grandchildren were the ones who helped him. They didn't know the story, but later on we discovered the story was that their great grandfather saved my father's life, and then my father's great grandchildren saved his great grandchildren's lives. There's one final story that I'm going to show you on the screen because I can't do justice to it the way the person who tells the story who was there does.
I know some people doubt the story because it's almost too perfect.
Make it louder.
I promise you it's a true story. In fact, someone was watching the story as I told it on a video in his store, and he was commenting to his wife saying, you think Prisky made this up? She's saying, I don't know, does he make up stories? Do you think he makes them up? I don't know, it's too... In the meantime, a customer comes in and they're arguing over price over a particular piece of jewelry, they're negotiating, whatever, where are you from? He says, I'm from Agora Hills. And they say, Agora Hills, you know Rarest? I know him quite well. Anyway, they're talking, and they say, well, we just watched the story, and they start telling him the story, and he says, that's about me. He's the character of the story. So if you doubt my story, he'll come visit you. All right. There was a group of rabbinic students who flew in to help us take care of the junior congregation for the high holidays. In our community, the High Holidays moves into a Hyatt hotel. We get over 1,000 people that join us, and a lot of kids. So we fly in a bunch of these rabbinic students from Crown Heights. The Shabbos in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, they're staying at one of my Balabatim's homes, one of their homes in Agora. And as they come to the house after davening, they see a moving truck next door. And the moving truck has the words on it, Nice Jewish Boys Moving Company. That's the name of a moving company in California. So these guys, this group of Bachrim, they go over to the guys and they say, you guys Jewish? A bunch of strong Israelis. They say, yeah. They say, Chaver, you're working hard. Why don't you take a break, come in, have some cholent, have some kugel, have a l'chaim, and then you'll go back. The guys look at each other, they sure. And they go into this house, they're sitting around the Shabbos table. I come by to visit my Bachram, I'm introduced to these strong guys. I start asking them about where you're going for Yom Kippur, they don't have a place, come join us. Sure, we'll be there. They start singing songs, having a great time. In the middle, one of them says, uh-oh. What's the uh-oh? The guy moving in next door just pulled up and we're drinking on the job. So one of the guys who's my nephew, who now lives in Scottsdale, Arizona, Yossi Brisky, says, I'll take care of it. He runs out, car parks, and he's standing there as the guy gets out and he says, hi, welcome to the neighborhood. The guy's a little startled, he's there with his 8-year-old girl, and he says, excuse me, do you happen to be Jewish? And the fellow looks up and he says, yeah, not only am I Jewish, I am the choir conductor and the music conductor in this Reform temple in the valley. So Jack and Megan are brought in and introduced to their movers. And they're sitting around the Shabbos table. And Jack knows songs, and he's singing away. And it's beautiful. They stay the entire Shabbos until Havdalah. Havdalah, Hine Matov Umana. Jack was living it up. It was wonderful. It was a great experience. And then after Shabbos, they continued to unload the truck. The next day, there's a note under my office door. And it says the following. It says, I want you to know that God works through you. That's all it said. God works through you. I was intrigued by this very strange note from this new friend, Jack. He had his phone number there on the note, so I called him up. And I said, thanks for the note, but what does it mean? He said, I don't know if you're the type of rabbi that believes in God or not, because I met 12 times. So this may sound silly to you, because it sounded silly to my rabbi. I don't want you to laugh at me, but before I got into my car to come to my new house in the Agora Hills, I turned to God and I said to him, if this is the right thing for me, send me a sign the moment I come to Agora. I open my door and a fellow is there and he says, welcome to Agora. Excuse me, are you Jewish? Why don't you sing some Shabbos songs for us? Now, I don't know what other way God could have possibly sent me a sign, so I don't know who you guys are, what you're doing here. I just want you to know that God worked through you. It was a great story. So I got up Yom Kippur and I tell this as my sermon. This is the way we need to treat people. We welcome them in, we don't chase them away. It's a perfect sermon, teaching the beauty of the Jewish soul. As I'm telling the story, the back row jumps up. It's my Israeli movers. They're there. Wow. This was really scoring. This was a great sermon. I even had the props in the audience. Okay. Postscript. I give a class on faith and suffering. I gave it a few years ago here at the JLI. It's a very difficult, emotional, gut-wrenching class. So we talk about a lot of pain that people experience in life. And when I give it in Agora, it's usually filled with people that have gone through some suffering in their life. And that particular year, as I'm giving it, my new neighbor friend, who started coming to classes at Chabad, he's sitting in the front row. And he's crying the entire class. As soon as the lecture is over, he runs up on stage and he just falls on my shoulders. And I said, do you want to talk? And he said, no. We went to my office and he says, look, there's a part of my life I haven't shared with you. You see, a year before I moved to Agura, my wife and I, we had 3 children. 2 of our 3 children were in a car accident and died. He said, I couldn't deal with the pain. I couldn't deal with the suffering. I couldn't cope with the loss. I couldn't deal with God. I was angry at him. I hated living. I couldn't walk back into a temple. I went into a deep, deep depression. I went from therapist to therapist. No one can help me. I lost my job. And then I lost my wife. She left me. She took Megan with her. They moved out. And now I was alone. And every single day it became darker and darker. The sun never came out for me. It was just pure darkness. And I decided that it's time for me to say farewell to this miserable world. I'm just going to leave. Commit suicide, and I wasn't scared of it. In fact, to me it would be a relief. The only thing I wanted to do, I wanted to say goodbye to my daughter. I wasn't going to tell her my plans, but I was going to take her out one night to say goodbye, and that night end my life. So I called my ex and I said I'd like to take Megan out to the movies. And she said okay. And I chose a movie theater in Simi Valley in a shopping center called the Mountain Gate Plaza Shopping Center. I come into the mall and I hear music. Now that mall is always empty. And as I get closer, I recognize the music. It's Jewish music. I know Jewish music. That's what I play. And then I see right at the entrance of the movie theater, there's a menorah there. It was Hanukkah that night. And there was a Hanukkah party going on right in front of a movie theater in Simi Valley. And before I know it, someone grabs my hand and starts dancing with me around a menorah. And there I am, clutching my daughter's hand, dancing around a menorah on the very night that I chose to end my life. And with each circle around the menorah, I felt God speaking to me, saying, there will be more celebration in your life. There will be light in your life. The flames of the menorah with its flickering was telling me, there's yet light, there's yet dance. Stick around. Don't leave. I went home that night and didn't kiss my daughter goodbye because I decided to stay. I went back to therapy. I got out of my depression. I got my job back. I started rebuilding my life. And I decided then that maybe I need a new community, a new home. I called a real estate agent and I said, find me a new community to move to, I don't care where. He picked Agora Hills. He found me a house. And Rabbi, the day that I moved, I turned to God and I said, if it was you in the Mountain Gate Plaza Shopping Center that night talking to me, please send me a sign when I come to Agora that you're watching over me. That's my story. I'm listening to this and I'm saying, wow. 1 second, Jack. I reach over to the bookcase there where I have photo albums, and I start racing through my Hanukkah photo albums. Mountain Gate Plaza Shopping Center. And I find a photo of me dancing with Jack that night around the menorah in Simi Valley, California. I remember that night because each year we've decided that we're going to light a menorah in another shopping center in another city. That year we picked Simi Valley. Why? Why not? That's the way we make decisions. No boards. Why not? So we need a shopping center if you're going to do it there. So we call 411 and we say, can I have the phone number of the shopping center in Simi Valley of the mall? And she says, which one? The one, the shopping mall. She says, you mean the Mountain Gate Plaza Shopping Center? Yeah, that's the one. That's the way we do things. The flyer is being designed, Chabad, Hanukkah at the Mountain Gate Plaza Shopping Center. It's already designed. We're putting labels on. Oh, maybe we should call them and ask them. We call them, we say, we'd like to do a Hanukkah program. And the lady says, you sure? We say, yeah. You sure? Okay. No problem. You want to do a Hanukkah program in our mall? Yeah. Okay, no problem. So we book the clown and the band and the balloons and everything, and we show up at the Mountain Gate Plaza Shopping Center that night, only to find out then, because we did such advanced planning, that it was a mall going totally out of business, that every store had already closed down, it was going to be demolished, and the only thing still left open in that mall was a movie theater. There were no people that night in the Mountain Gate Plaza Shopping Center. That's why she kept on saying, you're sure? We were saying, yeah, we're sure. We had no people. We had a clown, we had a band, we even had balloons, but we didn't have people. So we picked up our menorah and we decided we're going to park it right in front of a movie theater. And anyone that dares walks in to go to the movies that night is first going to have to dance around the menorah so that we don't feel totally stupid. I came home that night saying, wow, what a failure. What a bad night this was. We really bombed. There are no ordinary days in God's master plan. May Hashem and Tzaddik God maps it out. We were there for a reason because God wanted us there. To be there at that particular moment, at that particular place, to seize the moment. My friends, there are divine providence that goes on every single day of your life. There are the same stories that happened with Utah Rabbi, with Jack in the Mountain Gate Plaza, with Hannah Ferry on the phone, that happens in your life. Here is the moment, because every day is special. Thank you.
Have you ever heard a story like that?
Good storytelling.
Yeah, I heard this story from him about 15 years ago. Maybe more. The one thing I wanted to point out is that in some of these stories, if someone would not have made the effort to do something special, it wouldn't have happened. If that rabbi from Montreal, the business person rabbi, had not decided to ask the people at the nursing home, is there anyone Jewish in this nursing home, he would have just left, and he would have forgotten that whole experience. It would have been totally meaningless to him. The fact that he made the gesture, I want to do something good, that connected him to that individual who was buried through his own generosity. Same thing over here. If this rabbi would have decided, why bother putting up a menorah in this shopping center, this whole thing would not have happened. There are so many stories like that. Maybe not as dramatic as this one, and so many different parts coming together. But that's what divine providence is. The Baal Shem Tov, based on the whole idea of divine providence, taught us that everything a person sees or hears is to be taken as a lesson in how to better serve the Creator. We don't know of most of what goes on in the world. It doesn't come to our attention. There's so many things going on that we don't hear or we don't see because they're not relevant to us. But if something registers in our mind, we have to always ask ourselves, why did God want me to hear this? Why did God want me to see this? There must be some lesson in it. Sometimes we never find out what the lesson was. There's a biblical verse which says that God does miracles, wonders alone. What that means is that sometimes God does miracles and no one ever knows that it was a miracle. Someone could be walking down an area and someone drops a heavy thing, a heavy load, and you miss it by a few inches. You never even knew that that thing came flying down. There was a miracle. If you came a few seconds earlier, you would have been killed. There are miracles that happen all the time that we don't know of. But to the extent they were able to figure out what is the message that God is giving me, it wasn't an accident, it wasn't a coincidence. And it's really based on many different sources, but the Baal Shem Tov's way of interpreting the sources takes it to another level. For example, in the book of Proverbs, King Solomon says, "Know him in all your ways, know God in all your ways." The simple meaning is that whatever you do, you should always make sure to do things in accordance with God's will. But it means much more than that. It means that everything that happens, everything that goes your way, should help you have a deeper appreciation for God and His plan and His purpose. Job says, "From my flesh I see God." This is interpreted to mean that from my own experiences, my own interactions between my soul and my body could serve to give me some insight into God's relationship. The Talmud says, just like the soul fills the body, God fills the world. So you look at your soul, you look at your life, and you can extrapolate from that and recognize how God operates. The Mishnah says, "Who is wise? One who learns from every person." But it can be extended to mean person who learns from every experience. Every experience is a teacher. People who say, "I don't have any teachers, I'm autodidact." You're learning from life's experiences. And that's why Judaism puts so much emphasis on respecting the elderly. I remember reading about this Holocaust survivor, very famous Rebbitzin Esther Jungreis, that she was asked, because she had a very good command of English, very intelligent, very educated. So they asked her, "Which university did you go through? Where were you educated?" And she says, "The University of Bergen-Belsen, the death camp." That life's experiences are the greatest teachers, and that's why we respect a senior citizen, the Talmud says, even if he's not very well educated, because he's educated by life itself. Rashi, the famous commentator, when he describes the priestly garments, there's one garment called the ephod, which is translated as an apron, but the Torah does not describe what it looks like. And all the commentators are baffled by what that so-called apron looked like. And Rashi says, and this is unusual for Rashi, "My heart tells me that it's like the type of apron worn by noble women when they would ride on horses." And there's a tradition that Rashi was once going down the street and he sees this noble woman who was not dressed modestly, was riding on a horse, and it bothered Rashi that he was exposed to something immodest. Years later, when he wrote his commentary on the Torah, he says, "Now I know why, because God wanted me to be able to explain what the particular garment that a priest, that a Kohen would wear, that it was like the garment that this noblewoman wore. That's why God exposed me to it." In other words, he had a bad experience and he didn't know why, and his whole life he was looking for an answer to that, and he found the answer when he was giving his commentary on the Torah, describing the different garments, priestly garments. The famous Hasidic master, Rabbi Zusha, He said there are 7 lessons one could learn from a thief. If you want to know the 7 lessons, I hope you're not going to use them in the wrong way. It means you can learn from everything, even from a thief. There was a chassid who spent many years in the Soviet Gulag, and he said when he heard this comment, he says, apparently Reb Zusha did not spend time in the Soviet Gulag because he could learn many more than 7 lessons from thieves. And one final lesson for today. The Baal Shem Tov would love to teach his students not from a book, but from experiences. So we took them on a walk down the road, and it was the middle of the winter, and the river was frozen, entirely frozen, and there was a Russian peasant who was carving out a crucifix in the ice. So they said to the Baal Shem Tov, okay, now let me see if you could teach us a lesson from that. The crucifix for a Jew was a symbol of the other religion that we don't accept, that we reject. It's an idolatrous symbol for a Jew. And here you're telling us we should learn lessons from everything, and here there's a crucifix in the ice. So the Baal Shem Tov says there's a very powerful lesson. Water is the source of life. Water gives you life. But when the water freezes, you can turn it into an idol. When a Jew freezes and is cold and is indifferent, he can become an idol worshiper. So you can learn a lesson even from something that is, in our way of thinking, negative. And not to end on the word negative, you can learn many positive lessons, especially from positive things.
But what was the lesson that the Baal Shem Tov learned from that?
Was trying to instill in people the idea of life with warmth and enthusiasm. He couldn't tolerate when people would do a mitzvah with a cold attitude, perfunctorily. You have to be excited about it, enthusiastic. And that's the difference between heat and cold. Cold is indifference, is apathy, detachment. Okay. So when you're detached and you're cold, you can become an idol even. When you're warm, you become a source of life. That was the lesson that he taught. But sometimes you could learn the wrong lessons from life's experience. So next week we'll go into that, how to not interpret divine providence, or how best to interpret it. And that will take us deeper into the subject. Any questions? I'm sure every person could find in their own life stories of divine providence, where they were at the right place at the right time, said the right thing. And that should be a lesson that everything that happens in life is by divine providence. Any questions on the Zoom?